You all know that former President Jimmy Carter passed away. So Jimmy Carter died, and Jimmy Carter was 100 years old. I don't know as much about him as some of the other presidents, but that was okay, because Chris Hedges told me everything I needed to know about Jimmy Carter. And what I really like about this article is that Chris Hedges is not just focusing on the good that Jimmy Carter did. He actually takes a balanced approach, and he also focuses on the bad things that Jimmy Carter did. And we need to talk about that. There's a lot of people after Jimmy Carter passed away, they were giving him a lot of praise. And it's as if they forgot about some of these things that Jimmy Carter did during his presidency. You see, a lot of the good from Jimmy Carter that people speak of are things that he said or did after his presidency. So Chris Hedges decided to let people know. He said, wait a minute, hold up. Don't deify Jimmy Carter. He also has an audio version of this as well. Jimmy Carter may have done good works out of office, but in power, he fomented a series of domestic and foreign policy disasters. So peep this, fam. Thank you, Chris, for this one. Jimmy Carter is out of office, had the courage to call out the abominable oppression and persecution and strict segregation of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza in his 2006 book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Let's take a look at that. Here's Jimmy Carter talking about Israel being an apartheid state in this interview here with Piers Morgan. This is how you know Piers Morgan is full of it too. When Piers Morgan pretends like he's just hearing about what Israel is, you have to know that that is an act. This interview is from years ago. Take a look.
I think more than any other episode or incident or situation on earth, this is the most directly affecting adversely America in not bringing peace to Israel and justice and peace to the Palestinians. Yes.
You obviously were very successful in bringing peace with Israel and Egypt. Can any deal be done that doesn't involve sitting across a table with Hamas?
I've met several times with Hamas leadership, and I think they are willing to accept Israel to exist peacefully within the 67 borders or some modification of those borders. But the first step has to be to bring Hamas and Fatah together so they can have another honest election. That is a major premise, and I think the 67 borders between the two with some modifications will lead to a two-state solution. Netanyahu now, I believe, has decided unequivocally to move to a one-state solution, which every one of his predecessors in the prime ministership have condemned as a disaster for Israel. And I think Israel is now moving toward a disaster for itself and insisting that all the way from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea has to be Israeli controlled. That is a mistake. The word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an apartheid is.
We'll come back to that one right there. Okay, so that was Jimmy Carter talking to Piers Morgan. So again, like I told you, Piers Morgan, this is all an act. He knew what Israel was doing. He's spoken to people about this before, and that was many years ago. Let's go ahead and bring this back in here, because it goes on to say some of the good that Jimmy Carter did when he was out of office. This is what people got to remember. He dedicated himself to monitoring elections, including his controversial defense of the 2006 election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and championed human rights around the globe. He lambasted the American political process as an oligarchy in which unlimited political bribery created a complete subversion of our political system as a payoff to major contributors. So yes, those things are good. Like, I'm not going to deny, like, that's good. Great. But we have to also mention the bad. And that's what Chris Hedges does. But Carter's years as an ex-president should not mask his dog service to the empire, penchant for fomenting disastrous proxy wars, betrayal of the Palestinians. See, people leave this piece out. They talk about what he said about the Palestinians after office, but when he was in office, he betrayed them. So we can't forget that. The embrace of punishing neoliberal policies and his subservience to big business when he was in office. So again, Chris Hedges is calling out the good and the bad. Carter played a significant role in dismantling New Deal legislation with the deregulation of major industries, including airlines, banking, trucking, telecommunications, natural gas, and railways. He appointed Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve, who, in an effort to combat inflation, drove up interest rates and pushed the U.S. into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Hence why Carter probably lost. Here we go. A move that saw the start of punishing austerity cuts. Carter is the godfather of the pillage known as neoliberalism. A pillage fellow Democrat Bill Clinton would turbocharge. This part is important. What Chris Hedges is pointing out here is that a lot of times we point to Bill Clinton and we say it was Bill Clinton who changed the Democratic Party. But what Chris Hedges is pointing to is that that change actually started with Jimmy Carter. I didn't know this. So again, like, he was one of the presidents I didn't know as much about. And I wasn't alive when he was president either. And he's just not one of those presidents that we even studied in school. I remember, like, they didn't really talk much about Jimmy Carter. Just that Jimmy Carter didn't win re-election. That was kind of it, right? So pay attention to these things. Carter fell under the disastrous influence of his Svengali-like national security advisor, Brzezinski, a Polish exile who rejected the Nixon-Kissinger reliance on détente with the Soviet Union. Brzezinski's life mission, one that meant he saw the world in black and white, was to confront and destroy the Soviet Union, along with any government or movement he deemed to be under communist influence or sympathetic to it. If I am correct, I believe Brzezinski is Mia's father. So you guys know Joe and Mia on Morning Joe. I believe that's her father. He goes on to say here, Carter, under Brzezinski's influence, walked away from the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, SALT II, with the Soviet Union, which sought to curb nuclear weapons deployment. He increased military spending. He sent military aid to Indonesia. He sent military aid to Indonesian New Order government during the Indonesian invasion and occupation of East Timor, which many have characterized as a genocide. Well. I didn't hear people talk about this when Jimmy Carter passed away. This is why you gotta, this is why I read Chris Hedges' articles. Yeah, Mr. Lola said, yes, Mika is, that's what I thought. That's Mika's father. It goes on to say here, he supported, along with the apartheid state of South Africa, the murderous counter-revolutionary group, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, led by Jonas Savimbi. He provided aid to the brutal Zairian dictator Mobutu. He supported the Khmer Rouge. So did you guys know that Jimmy Carter, it says along with the apartheid state of South Africa? So that's bad. And I didn't know this. Again, you learn something new every day. First Amendment said Chomsky told this about Carter, crimes of U.S. presidents. Like, this is bad. So he was agreeing alongside there with apartheid South Africa. Wild stuff, man. He instructed the CIA to back opposition groups and political parties to bring down the Sandinista government in Nicaragua once it took power in 1979, leading under the Reagan administration to the formation of the Contras and a bloody and senseless U.S.-backed insurgency. This was a domino effect, because what Chris Hedges is saying is that this domino effect, at least with the Democratic Party, it seems like it actually started with Jimmy Carter, not with Bill Clinton. So some of the actions of Jimmy Carter during his presidency led to some of the actions of Ronald Reagan during his presidency. It's almost as if Jimmy Carter painted. No. It's almost like Jimmy Carter paved the way for Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Now, you have to remember something else about Jimmy Carter. Remember, he had a primary challenge. That was Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy did win states during the primary challenge. Now, of course, he didn't win the primary. And Jimmy Carter went on to run for president again. And he lost. That's when Ronald Reagan won. And what people have alluded to since this day is that because Jimmy Carter faced a strong primary challenge, which is Ted Kennedy, that actually led to his loss in the general election, because it showed that there were some states that wanted to support Ted Kennedy. I mean, these are things I'm just, you learn along the way. But Jimmy Carter was no saint. I mean, this is what Chris Hedges is pointing out. He provided military aid to the dictatorship in El Salvador, ignoring an appeal from Archbishop Oscar Romero, later assassinated, to cease U.S. arms shipments. Why isn't anybody talking about? He poisoned U.S. relations with Iran by backing the repressive regime of Shah Mohammad Reza until the last minute, and then allowing the deposed Shah to seek medical treatment in New York, triggering the occupation of the U.S. embassy in Tehran and a 444-day hostage crisis. Does everybody remember this? Some of you are old enough to remember this, the Iran hostage crisis. So this is wild, right? Carter's belligerence, he froze Iranian assets, stopped importing oil from Iran, and expelled 183 Iranian diplomats from the U.S. This played into Ayatollah's demonization of the U.S. and calls for Islamic rule. He obliterated the credibility of Iran's secular opposition. Fam. This cannot be ignored. It really can't when you look at some of the connections here. Yes, Yantra. Yantra said Jimmy did that. Yes. So these are the things that people are not discussing about Jimmy Carter. So it's important that you do know this. And Chris Hedges went deep. Carter gave Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, although he ruled under martial law, billions in military aid. Jesus Christ. He armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan after the Soviet intervention in 1979, a decision that cost the U.S. $3 billion, saw the deaths of 1.5 million Afghans, and led to the creation of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So as much as people are talking about Al-Qaeda, Jimmy Carter's connected to that too. When you have a moment, please read the full article, this article here from Chris Hedges. Eric can put it in the chat. And this part right here, he backed the South Korean military in 1980 when it laid siege to the city of Gwaju, where protesters had formed a militia, which led to the massacre of some 2,000 people. And here's the part where he screwed over the Palestinian people. He sold out the Palestinians when he negotiated a separate peace deal known as the Camp David Accords. In 1979, between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, sorry for the names, you guys, the agreement excluded the Palestine Liberation Organization from the talks. Israel never, as promised, to Carter attempted to resolve the Palestine question with Jordan and Egypt's involvement. It never permitted Palestinian self-government in the West Bank and Gaza within 5 years. It did not end Israeli settlements, a refusal that led Carter to later claim Begin had lied to him. But since there was no mechanism in the agreement for enforcement, and since Carter was unwilling to defy the Israeli lobby to impose sanctions on Israel, the Palestinians found themselves once again powerless and abandoned. But some people, they only want to focus on the things that he said about Gaza and Palestine after his presidency, like this interview here with Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!
Is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except their Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other. And the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know. And many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that is far transcends what any outsider would imagine.
And we'll stop it there because we can't show everything. But what I was saying is that that's the part about Jimmy Carter that a lot of people will retweet or they will, give him applause for. But they're not talking about how he sold the Palestinians out when he was in office, when he was president. They're not talking about all the things I just read to you from Chris Hedges' article. They're only calling out the good things that Jimmy Carter did after he was president. And they're not talking about how he actually increased some of these military conflicts, how he escalated tensions when it came to geopolitics. They're not talking about some of those things. And so there is a such thing as nuance. And what I liked about that article is that Chris Hedges said, don't deify Jimmy Carter. I mean, you ain't got to throw him under a rock. But at the same time, there are people out here pretending like Jimmy Carter was a saint and did everything right. And a lot of you probably didn't even know about the information I just read to you from that article. So there's good things and there's bad things. So don't deify Jimmy Carter. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.